You probably won't survive what happened to Celia, but she did for 5 brutal years. Picture this, it's 1850, and you're standing in a Missouri courthouse where human beings are being sold like livestock. The auctioneer's voice echoes off stone walls as he calls out prices for people who legally own nothing, not even their own bodies. In this world, you're about to meet a 14-year-old girl whose name will one day force America to confront its most uncomfortable truths about power, consent, and justice. You watch as 60-year-old Robert Newsom, a prosperous farmer from Callaway County, examines the teenage girl before him. She's small, maybe 5 feet tall, with hands already calloused from fieldwork. To Newsom, she represents an investment strong enough for labor, young enough for other purposes he's already calculating. To the legal system of 1850s Missouri, she's nothing more than chattel, a piece of property with no more rights than a horse or a plow. Her name is Celia, and she has no idea she's about to become the center of a legal earthquake. You follow Newsom as he completes the transaction, counting out bills while Celia stands silent, her eyes fixed on the ground. Missouri law is crystal clear on her status. She is property, pure and simple. The Missouri Revised Statutes define enslaved people as chattels personal, meaning they can be bought, sold, inherited, or disposed of at their owner's whim. You realize that in this moment, Celia has fewer legal protections than the livestock in Newsom's barn. The journey to Newsom's farm takes you through rolling Missouri countryside, but you notice Celia isn't admiring the scenery. She's calculating, memorizing landmarks, studying the rhythm of the wagon wheels, already planning. Historians still debate whether enslaved people truly understood their legal powerlessness or held on to hope for protection that did not exist. But Celia's story suggests she grasped her situation with terrifying clarity. You arrive at Newsom's 800-acre farm, where he's built himself a comfortable life through the labor of enslaved people. The main house sits on a hill overlooking fields worked by human property, and you notice something peculiar about the quarters where enslaved people live. Celia's cabin sits unusually close to the main house, close enough that the master can visit whenever he pleases. This isn't coincidence. It's calculated positioning. Within hours of her arrival, you witness the beginning of what will become 5 years of systematic abuse. Missouri law provides no protection for enslaved women against sexual assault by their masters. In fact, the legal system actively enables it. You discover that under Missouri statute, rape is defined as the unlawful carnal knowledge of a woman by force. Since masters legally own their enslaved people, no sexual act between them can be considered unlawful regardless of consent or force. You observe as Newsom establishes his pattern of control over Celia, visiting her cabin regularly and making clear that resistance is futile. She is trapped in a legal catch-22 that defines the American slavery system. She is human enough to be held responsible for crimes, but property enough to be denied protection from them. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. She can be executed for murder, but cannot be raped because she has no legal right to refuse consent. Years pass, and you watch Celia navigate an impossible existence. She bears 2 children to Newsom, though Missouri law considers them his property as well. You notice something remarkable about her demeanor during these years. She doesn't break. Instead, she develops relationships within the enslaved community, forms alliances, and quietly builds the social connections that will prove crucial later. There's George, an enslaved man who wants to marry her, and other enslaved people who recognize her intelligence and determination. The legal framework surrounding Celia grows more complex as you delve deeper. Missouri's status as a border state creates unique tensions. It's officially a slave state, but anti-slavery sentiment bubbles beneath the surface. You realize that Celia exists at the intersection of multiple legal contradictions. She is property but can be criminally prosecuted. She's denied personhood but expected to follow moral codes. She's considered incapable of consent, but can be held fully accountable for her actions. By 1855, you notice changes in Celia's situation. She is no longer a frightened teenager, but a young woman who has survived 5 years of brutalization while maintaining her sanity and humanity. George has been pressuring her to end her relationship with Newsom, not understanding that she has no power to do so. The tension between her desire for a normal relationship and her legal powerlessness creates a pressure cooker situation that is about to explode. You sense something building as summer approaches. Celia's behavior changes subtly. She's more watchful, more calculated. She's begun to understand something that will shock the legal establishment. Even property has limits, and she's reached hers. The girl who legally owned nothing is about to claim the most fundamental right of all, the right to defend her own body, regardless of what the law says about her status as property. You're standing in Celia's cabin on the night of June 23, 1855, and you can feel the tension crackling like electricity before a thunderstorm. The air is thick with Missouri summer heat, but something else hangs heavy tonight. The weight of 5 years of accumulated rage, desperation, and a decision that's been building like pressure in a steam engine. You watch as Celia moves around her small space, her movements deliberate and controlled, while her 2 young children sleep peacefully in the corner, unaware that their mother is about to shatter the legal foundation of American slavery. Earlier that day, you witnessed the conversation that set everything in motion. George, the enslaved man who wants to marry Celia, confronted her with an ultimatum that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of her situation. He demanded she end her relationship with Master Newsom as if she had any choice in the matter. You see the cruel irony. George, himself enslaved and powerless, somehow expects Celia to exercise agency she legally doesn't possess. But his words plant something dangerous in her mind, the radical idea that she might actually have the right to say no. You follow Celia as she approaches Newsom earlier that evening, summoning courage that 5 years of brutalization should have destroyed. She does something unprecedented. She tells her master that their sexual relationship must end. You watch Newsom's face transform from surprise to cold anger. As he processes this unthinkable defiance, property doesn't make demands. Livestock doesn't negotiate terms. His response is swift and predictable. He'll visit her cabin tonight, just as he has hundreds of times before, and she'll remember exactly what she is. The peculiar detail that historians often overlook is Celia's methodical preparation. You observe her gathering kindling, stoking her fireplace to unusual intensity for such a warm night, and positioning a heavy stick later identified as a fire poker within easy reach. This isn't the panicked improvisation of a desperate moment. It's calculated planning that suggests Celia has been thinking about this possibility for weeks, maybe months. You wait with her as footsteps approach the cabin around 10 o'clock. Newsom's routine is unchanged. He enters without knocking, his sense of ownership absolute. But tonight, something is different. You sense Celia's transformed energy as she makes one final attempt at negotiation, pleading with him to leave her alone, to respect her relationship with George, to acknowledge some shred of her humanity. Historians still debate whether this final plea was genuine hope for mercy or calculated theater to establish her later legal defense, but you see the desperation in her eyes as real. Newsom's response shatters any remaining illusion about her status. He moves toward her with the casual entitlement of a man claiming his property, and in that moment, you witness the collision of 2 worldviews, his assumption of absolute ownership versus her emerging recognition of fundamental human dignity. The legal system of 1855 Missouri has prepared for many scenarios, but not for this property that refuses to be property. What happens next unfolds with shocking swiftness. You see Celia grab the fire poker as Newsom advances, and her swing connects with brutal precision. The sound, a hollow crack that will echo through American legal history, drops the 60-year-old man instantly. You watch as he crumples to the floor of the cabin, blood pooling beneath his head, while Celia stands over him with the weapon still in her hands, breathing hard and staring at what she's done. But you realize that killing her master is only the beginning of Celia's problems. A dead white man in a slave cabin is evidence of the ultimate crime against the social order. You observe her next actions with fascination and horror as she demonstrates the same methodical intelligence that characterized her preparation. She checks for signs of life, finds none, and immediately begins implementing a plan that suggests she's thought through this scenario before. The disposal of Robert Newsom's body reveals Celia's understanding of both the physical and legal reality she faces. You watch as she drags his corpse to a fireplace, the same hearth she'd been stoking all evening, and begins the grim work of cremation. The fire burns hot and long, consuming flesh and bone while Celia tends it through the night, like some macabre funeral pyre. She understands instinctively that without a body, there can be no murder charge, at least not easily. You notice the methodical thoroughness of her destruction of evidence. She grinds the remaining bone fragments with a pestle, scatters the ashes, and burns Newsom's clothing. By dawn, virtually no physical trace of Robert Newsom remains. The only evidence of the night's events is Celia's haunted expression and the lingering smell of burnt flesh that will cling to her cabin for weeks. But you also observe a crucial miscalculation in her plan. Newsom's sudden disappearance from a routine that's been consistent for 5 years will raise immediate questions. His family knows his habits, his neighbors know his schedule, and enslaved people on the plantation know exactly where he goes after dark. Celia has eliminated the physical evidence but cannot erase the pattern of behavior that will point investigators directly to her cabin. As dawn breaks on June 24, 1855, you watch Celia attempt to return to normal routines, but her world has fundamentally changed. She's crossed a line that American law considers uncrossable. Property has destroyed its owner. The legal system she's about to face has no framework for processing this crime, no precedent for adjudicating a case where the victim and perpetrator exists in a relationship the law defines as impossible. You rewatching the Newsom household wake up to an absence that feels wrong from the very first moment. It's June 24, 1855, and Robert Newsom's morning routine breakfast at precisely 7. Inspection of the fields by 8 has been disrupted by his complete disappearance. You observe his family moving through their morning with growing unease, their calls for him echoing across the farm with increasing desperation. Nobody wants to find what they're looking for, because deep down they already suspect where this leads. You follow Newsom's daughters, Virginia and Mary, as they check his bedroom, the barn, the fields, anywhere except the one place their father visited most regularly after dark. There's a willful blindness in their search, a collective family denial about the master's nocturnal habits that suddenly becomes impossible to maintain. The peculiar detail that makes this investigation so uncomfortable is how everyone involved knows exactly where to look but desperately hopes they won't have to. The initial questioning begins with Coffee Wainscott, an enslaved man who lived near Celia's cabin. You watch as Virginia Newsom approaches him with barely concealed panic, demanding to know if he saw her father the previous evening. Wainscott's response is carefully neutral. He heard voices from Celia's cabin around 10 o'clock but saw nothing more. His testimony walks the dangerous line that enslaved people must navigate, truthful enough to avoid punishment for lying, vague enough to avoid volunteering damaging information. You observe the family's growing realization that they must confront the reality of their father's relationship with Celia. This isn't just about a missing person anymore. It's about acknowledging a system of abuse that everyone pretended not to see. The investigation forces them to speak aloud what had been carefully unspoken for 5 years. That Robert Newsom regularly raped his enslaved woman and that her cabin was his primary destination after dark. When the family finally approaches Celia directly, you witnessed a masterclass in desperate improvisation. She maintains that Newsom never came to her cabin the previous night, suggesting he might have gone to visit neighbors or fallen into the nearby creek. Her performance is convincing enough to buy her a few precious hours, but you notice the slight tremor in her hands and the way her eyes avoid direct contact. She's playing for time, but time for what? Escape is impossible, and the evidence, though destroyed, has left traces only a thorough search will reveal. The breakthrough comes from an unexpected source. You watch as the family questions other enslaved people on the plantation, and one detail emerges that shatters Celia's story. Several people report seeing unusually bright flames from her cabin late into the night. In rural Missouri, where candles and oil are precious commodities, a fire burning past midnight attracts attention. The enslaved community's careful network of observation, usually used for protection and communication, now becomes the thread that unravels Celia's alibi. Historians still debate whether the enslaved community deliberately exposed Celia or simply responded truthfully to direct questioning, but you sense the complexity of their position. They record between loyalty to one of their own and the dangerous reality that lying to white authorities about a missing master could result in collective punishment for the entire plantation. Their survival depends on a delicate balance of truth and omission that's about to collapse. You follow the search party as they focus on Celia's cabin with increasing intensity. The physical evidence she thought she'd destroyed begins revealing itself under close examination. Bone fragments in the fireplace, ashes, the lingering smell of burnt flesh, and most damning of all, metal buttons from Newsom's clothing that survived the flames. The cremation that seemed so thorough in darkness proves inadequate under daylight scrutiny. The moment of Celia's confession arrives with startling suddenness. You watch as the accumulated evidence makes denial impossible, and she shifts from elaborate lies to a stark admission that will shock Missouri's legal establishment. Yes, she killed Robert Newsom. Yes, she burned his body in a fireplace. But her explanation for why she did it introduces a legal concept that will turn the trial into a philosophical battleground about the nature of property, personhood, and consent. You observe the investigator's discomfort as Celia describes 5 years of systematic sexual abuse with matter-of-fact clarity that strips away all romantic mythology about the master-slave relationship. Her testimony forces them to confront the brutal reality that everyone pretended not to see. Robert Newsom didn't have a relationship with Celia. He owned her body and used it whenever he pleased. Regardless of her wishes or physical condition, the legal machinery begins grinding into motion. But you notice something unprecedented happening. Usually, the murder of a white man by an enslaved person results in immediate mob justice or a perfunctory trial ending in execution. But Celia's case presents a problem that stops everyone in their tracks. How do you prosecute property for defending itself against its owner? The legal system has no framework for processing this crime because it challenges the fundamental assumptions upon which slavery depends. You watch as word of the case spreads through Missouri's legal community, creating ripples of confusion and concern. Prosecutors realize they're facing a case that could set dangerous precedents, while defense attorneys see an opportunity to challenge slavery's legal foundation. The investigation that began as a simple search for a missing person has uncovered a legal paradox that will force Missouri's courts to confront questions they've spent decades avoiding. As preparations for trial begin, you sense the broader implications starting to crystallize. Celia's case isn't just about one woman's desperate act of self-defense. It's about whether enslaved people possess any rights that their masters are bound to respect. The investigation has revealed not just a crime, but a fundamental contradiction in American law that can no longer be ignored. You're sitting in the law office of John Jameson on a sweltering July morning in 1855, watching a man wrestle with the most impossible legal challenge in Missouri history. Jameson, a respected attorney in his 40s, stares at the case files spread across his desk with the expression of someone who's been asked to prove that water flows uphill. He's just agreed to defend Celia, and you can see him beginning to grasp the magnitude of what he's undertaken, not just defending a client, but potentially dismantling the entire legal foundation of American slavery. The peculiar detail that makes Jameson's situation even more surreal is that he owns enslaved people himself. You watch him struggle with the cognitive dissonance of arguing that enslaved women have rights while simultaneously owning human beings on his own property. This isn't abstract legal philosophy for him. It's a direct challenge to his economic interests and social position. Yet something about Celia's case compels him forward. Perhaps the lawyer's instinctive attraction to an impossible challenge, or maybe a flicker of genuine moral awakening. You observe Jameson's initial strategy sessions as he tries to construct a defense from legal materials that actively work against him. Missouri law is explicitly clear. Enslaved people are property, and property cannot commit crimes against its owner. The precedents are overwhelmingly hostile, the statutes are unambiguous, and public opinion ranges from indifferent to bloodthirsty. Most lawyers would advise a guilty plea and hope for merciful sentencing. But Jameson sees something else, a hairline crack in slavery's legal armor that might be widened into a fissure. The breakthrough comes when Jameson discovers Missouri's rape statute, and you witness the moment he realizes he might have found his weapon. The law defines rape as the unlawful carnal knowledge of a woman by force and against her will, but it doesn't explicitly exclude enslaved women from protection. This creates a legal loophole that slavery's architects never anticipated. If enslaved women can be raped, then they possess the right to defend themselves against sexual assault, even by their masters. You follow Jameson as he researches precedents across multiple states, searching for any case where courts have recognized enslaved people's right to self-defense. The results are discouraging. Decades of legal decisions consistently deny enslaved people any rights that might conflict with their master's property interests. But Jameson finds occasional dissenting opinions, minority voices that suggest some judges have wrestled with these contradictions, even if they never resolve them in favor of the enslaved. The defense strategy that emerges is breathtakingly audacious in its simplicity. You watch Jameson craft arguments that accept slavery's existence while challenging its absolute nature. He won't argue that Celia isn't enslaved property that would be impossible to sustain. Instead, he'll argue that even enslaved women retain certain fundamental rights, particularly the right to defend themselves against sexual assault. It's a strategy that threads the needle between abolition and accommodation, potentially preserving slavery while limiting its most brutal excesses. Historians still debate whether Jameson truly believed in his arguments or simply saw an opportunity for legal fame, but you observe genuine passion in his preparation. He interviews Celia extensively, documenting 5 years of systematic abuse with meticulous detail. Her testimony reveals the calculated nature of Newsom's control threats against her children if she resisted, physical violence when she showed reluctance, and the complete isolation that made resistance seem impossible until the final night. You notice how Jameson's defense requires him to perform a delicate balancing act with public opinion. He must present Celia as sympathetic enough to deserve protection while avoiding any suggestion that enslaved people generally have the right to resist their masters. The argument is specifically about sexual assault, carefully limited to avoid broader challenges to slavery's power structure. It's legal surgery with a scalpel rather than an axe. The prosecution's response crystallizes around a simple but devastating argument that you hear prosecutor Robert Pruitt developing. Property cannot commit murder against its owner because the relationship itself makes such a crime legally impossible. If courts recognize enslaved people's right to kill their masters in self-defense, the entire system of slavery becomes uninvalid. Every act of resistance could be justified as self-defense. Every instance of discipline could be challenged as abuse. You observe the broader legal community's reaction as word spreads about Jameson's defense strategy. Northern newspapers begin covering the case as a potential breakthrough for anti-slavery arguments, while Southern legal journals express alarm about the dangerous precedents being established. The case is transforming from a local criminal matter into a national referendum on slavery's legal limits. The most challenging aspect of Jameson's preparation involves convincing Celia to testify on her own behalf, something that requires her to describe years of sexual abuse in graphic detail before an all-white, all-male jury. You watch him explain that her testimony is crucial for establishing the self-defense claim, while acknowledging that Missouri law doesn't generally allow enslaved people to testify against white people. The legal contradictions multiply. Celia can be tried as a responsible moral agent but cannot testify as a credible witness. As the trial date approaches, you sense Jameson's growing realization that he's attempting something unprecedented in American legal history. No court has ever seriously considered whether enslaved people possess the right of self-defense against their masters. His arguments challenge not just Missouri law but the philosophical foundations upon which the entire slavery system rests. The defense he's crafting could either establish crucial precedents for human rights or collapse spectacularly, taking Celia's life with it. You're packed into the sweltering Callaway County Courthouse on October 9, 1855, surrounded by a crowd that represents every tension tearing at Missouri's social fabric. The air thrums with barely contained hostility as farmers, lawyers, journalists, and curious onlookers squeeze onto wooden benches that creak ominously under the weight of history being made. You notice how the room divides itself along invisible lines, slaveholders on one side, their faces set in grim the determination to preserve the natural order, while a smaller group of anti-slavery sympathizers clusters near the back, trying to look inconspicuous while witnessing what might become a crucial moment in their cause. Judge William Hall presides with the demeanor of a man who wishes he were anywhere else in the world. You watch him survey the packed courtroom, fully aware that his decisions over the next few days will reverberate far beyond Callaway County. Hall is no radical. He owns enslaved people himself and has consistently upheld Missouri's slavery statutes. But Celia's case forces him to navigate legal territory that no American judge has mapped before. The peculiar detail that makes his position even more uncomfortable is that his own legal reputation depends on appearing to follow established law while potentially creating entirely new precedents. You observe Celia as she enters the courtroom, a small figure in a simple dress who seems almost anticlimactic after months of building anticipation. She's 20 years old now, though the years of abuse have aged her beyond her chronological years. Her composure surprises you. There's no theatrical desperation or melodramatic pleading, just a quiet dignity that forces the crowd to confront the humanity they've been trained to deny. Several jurors shift uncomfortably as they look at her, perhaps realizing for the first time that they're judging a person rather than property. Prosecutor Robert Pruitt opens with arguments that slice straight to the heart of Missouri's legal system. You listen as he methodically dismantles any notion that enslaved people possess rights that could justify killing their masters. His logic is brutally simple. Celia is property, Newsom was her owner, and property cannot commit murder against its proprietor any more than a gun can murder its wielder. To accept Jameson's defense arguments would undermine the entire legal foundation upon which Missouri's economy and social order rest. The prosecution's case unfolds with devastating efficiency. You watch as witness after witness establishes the basic facts. Newsom is dead. Celia killed him. She burned his body to conceal the crime. Pruitt presents these facts without embellishment, understanding that the stark reality of an enslaved person killing her master speaks for itself to a jury of white property owners. His strategy avoids any discussion of motive or circumstance, focusing entirely on the simple question of whether property can murder its owner. When Jameson rises to present his defense, you feel the courtroom's tension ratchet higher. His opening argument is a masterpiece of legal threading, acknowledging Celia's enslaved status while arguing that Missouri law still protects her from sexual assault. You notice how carefully he phrases each point to avoid challenging slavery itself, while carving out space for fundamental human rights. It's a performance that requires him to be simultaneously radical and conservative, revolutionary and accommodating. The testimony that follows forces the courtroom to confront truths that polite society prefers to ignore. You listen as witness after witness describes the systematic nature of Newsom's abuse, the regular nighttime visits, Celia's obvious distress, the children born from these encounters. Historians still debate whether Missouri society genuinely didn't know about such abuse or simply agreed not to discuss it. But the trial testimony strips away all comfortable illusions about the master-slave relationship. Jameson's cross-examination of prosecution witnesses reveals the careful choreography required to maintain slavery's facade of legitimacy. You watch him expose the willful blindness of Newsom's family and neighbors, their determined refusal to acknowledge what everyone knew was happening. His questions force them to admit awareness of the abuse, while maintaining they considered it normal and legal, a contradiction that highlights slavery as moral bankruptcy. The most dramatic moment arrives when Jameson calls Celia to testify in her own defense, something that pushes against Missouri's restrictions on enslaved people giving testimony. You observe Judge Hall wrestling with the legal contradiction. If Celia is competent to stand trial as a moral agent responsible for her actions, how can she simultaneously be incompetent to testify about her own experiences? His decision to allow her testimony creates a precedent that prosecutors will challenge throughout the trial. Celia's testimony transforms the courtroom atmosphere completely. You listen as she describes 5 years of systematic rape with matter-of-fact clarity that forces everyone present to confront the brutal reality behind slavery's genteel mythology. Her account of the final night, Newsom's casual assumption of access to her body, her desperate plea for him to leave her alone, his violent response to her resistance strips away any remaining pretense about consent or mutual affection. The prosecution's response to Celia's testimony reveals the impossible contradiction at slavery's heart. You watch Pruitt argue that her account, even if true, changes nothing about her legal status. Enslaved women cannot be raped by their masters because they have no legal right to refuse consent. Property cannot be assaulted because assault requires victimhood, and property cannot be victimized. His argument is legally sound under Missouri statutes, but morally repugnant to anyone willing to recognize Celia's humanity. As closing arguments approach, you sense the jury's discomfort with the choice they're being forced to make. Acquitting Celia establishes dangerous precedents that could destabilize slavery throughout Missouri, while convicting her requires them to deny that enslaved women deserve any protection from sexual violence. There's no middle ground, no compromise position that preserves both slavery and basic human dignity. You're witnessing the jury file back into the courtroom on October 10, 1855. Their faces grim with the weight of a decision that no 12 men should have to make. The deliberation lasted only hours, but you sense that each minute stretched like an eternity, as they wrestled with a choice between legal precedent and human conscience. Judge Hall's instructions had been clear. If they believed enslaved women had the right to defend themselves against sexual assault, they must acquit. If they believed property could not commit crimes against its owner, they must convict. There was no middle ground in American law for the contradiction Celia's case exposed. The foreman rises with visible reluctance, and you hear the word that seals Celia's fate: guilty. The verdict hits the packed courtroom like a physical blow, but you notice something unexpected in the reactions. There's no celebration from the slave-holding crowd, no sense of justice triumphant. Instead, there is an uncomfortable silence that speaks to everyone, as awareness that they've just witnessed something morally bankrupt disguised as legal necessity. Even those who demanded conviction seem troubled by what they've accomplished. Judge Hall's sentencing proves equally uncomfortable, as you watch him struggle to maintain judicial dignity while implementing a decision that violates basic human decency. He sentences Celia to death by hanging, to be carried out on November 16, 1855. But the peculiar detail that reveals his own discomfort is the unusual delay he builds into the execution date, nearly 6 weeks away, providing time for appeals that he clearly hopes someone will file. Even though he cannot suggest such action from the bench, Jameson immediately files appeals that you follow through Missouri's higher courts, watching as each level of the judicial system grapples with the same impossible contradictions that trapped the original jury. The Missouri Supreme Court faces the same choice: uphold slavery's legal framework or acknowledge that enslaved people possess fundamental rights that masters must respect. Their eventual decision to uphold the conviction surprises no one, but you notice the tortured reasoning in their opinion, the careful legal language that avoids confronting the moral implications of their ruling. The months between conviction and execution revealed something remarkable about Celia's case that extends far beyond Missouri's borders. You observe as newspapers across the country pick up the story, with Northern abolitionists using it as evidence of slavery's inherent brutality, while Southern papers defend the verdict as necessary for maintaining social order. The case becomes a national symbol of the contradictions tearing America apart, a preview of the conflicts that will explode into civil war within 6 years. During her final months in jail, you watch Celia become an unlikely catalyst for legal and social change that extends far beyond her individual fate. Her case forces lawyers, judges, and legislators across the country to confront questions they've successfully avoided for decades. Do enslaved people possess any rights that masters must respect? Can property defend itself against its owner? What happens when legal precedent conflicts with basic human dignity? The most significant long-term impact emerges in the legal precedents Celia's case establishes. Even in defeat, you trace how Jameson's defense arguments, though unsuccessful, provide a roadmap for future challenges to slavery's absolute nature. His contention that enslaved women retain the right to defend themselves against sexual assault will be cited in dozens of later cases, gradually eroding the legal fiction that enslaved people possess no rights whatsoever. Historians still debate whether Celia understood the broader implications of her case or focused solely on her immediate survival, but you sense in her final statements a woman who grasped the historical significance of her situation. Her willingness to testify about years of abuse, despite knowing it would be used against her in court, suggests someone determined to force America to confront truths it preferred to ignore. The execution itself, carried out on December 21, 1855, after a brief escape and recapture that added final drama to her story, represents both an ending and a beginning. You witness the somber crowd that gathers to watch Missouri hang a woman whose only crime was defending her body against systematic rape. The moral bankruptcy of the moment is so obvious that even hardened supporters of slavery seem uncomfortable with the spectacle they've demanded. But Celia's death marks the beginning rather than the end of her impact on American law. You trace how her case becomes a touchstone for the legal arguments that will eventually challenge slavery as foundations during and after the Civil War. The precedents established by her trial, however hostile to her immediate interests, create cracks in slavery's legal armor that future attorneys will widen into decisive fissures. The transformation of American legal thinking about consent, self-defense, and women's rights owes an unacknowledged debt to Celia's courage in that Missouri cabin on June 23, 1855. Her refusal to accept a legal fiction that she had no right to defend her own body forced the American legal system to confront contradictions it could no longer ignore, setting in motion changes that would reshape the country's understanding of human rights and legal personhood. And so you reach the end of Celia's story. Though her influence ripples forward through generations of legal precedent and moral awakening that continue shaping American jurisprudence today, her case, buried in 19th-century court records that few people read, quietly revolutionized how American law thinks about consent, self-defense, and the fundamental rights that belong to all human beings regardless of their legal status. The young woman who legally owned nothing when she entered that Missouri courthouse left behind something invaluable. Proof that human dignity cannot be legislated away, that the right to defend one's own body transcends any law that attempts to deny it. Her lawyer's arguments, though unsuccessful in saving her life, provided the intellectual foundation for countless future victories in civil rights courts, women's rights cases, and criminal defense trials where the powerless faced the powerful. You can trace Celia's legal DNA through landmark Supreme Court decisions that expanded constitutional protections, through state laws that recognized marital rape as a crime, through criminal justice reforms that acknowledged domestic violence as grounds for self-defense. Each victory built upon arguments first articulated in that Callaway County courthouse, where John Jameson dared to suggest that enslaved women retained the right to say no to sexual assault. Perhaps most remarkably, Celia's story demonstrates how individual acts of courage can transform entire legal systems, how one person's refusal to accept injustice can reshape society's understanding of justice itself. She faced a legal system designed to deny her humanity and forced it to confront the contradictions that ultimately led to its transformation. In quiet moments, when you consider how far American law has traveled from the world that condemned Celia to death for defending herself, you might remember that progress often begins with someone deciding they've endured enough. Someone choosing dignity over survival. Someone willing to challenge a system that seems unchangeable until the moment it finally changes. Her name was Celia, and she changed everything.